Made possible through support from ARC Thrift Stores, Colorado Developmental Disabilities Council, Developmental Pathways, the Limbaugh Law Firm, and the ARC of Aurora. A THINK+change training.
Hello everyone, thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Erica Dennison and I work for THINK+change. Here today talking all about really important stuff about disability, assets, finances, and really what you need to know. This multi-part series is just one episode out of many external experts that we're going to be meeting with out in our community, really learning about all these really complicated financial questions that a lot of people in the disability community have. And so today I am joined by a special guest that I'm so happy is meeting with us today. But before we dive in, for you to just give your introduction and tell everyone who you are and what you do, I do just want to let everyone know we're not here to give you any type of medical or legal advice. And so if you do have really specific questions, to please reach out to your own medical or legal advisors. So now that I've covered that, I would love for you to introduce yourself and let our viewers and listeners know who you are and what you do.
Great. Thanks, Erica. My name is Megan Brand. I'm the Executive Director of the Colorado Fund for People with Disabilities, or CFPD. We're a nonprofit organization that was founded in 1994. We serve over 1,200 people with disabilities across the state of Colorado. And we were founded back in 1994 as the first pooled trust in Colorado, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. And in addition to the pooled trust, now we have multiple other services, including administering individual trusts, both first and third party. We serve as an organizational representative payee, which we're going to talk about in a little bit. And then we also have a very unique program called Mission Supports that's funded by the City and County of Denver Mill Levy funds, supporting people with intellectual developmental disabilities who are experiencing homelessness. And we also serve as court-appointed conservator and provide fee-for-service case management, typically for people who have trust funds. So that's, a pretty broad range of services, mostly having to do with fiduciary work.
Yeah, I knew you guys did all this fiduciary work, but I had no idea all the additional programs you guys do. So that's what I love about these podcast series, is we get to learn about all this really great work that's going on within our community that can be a resource for people. So that's great. Thank you for sharing that.
You're welcome.
So Megan here today is going to be really covering more so those frequently asked questions that a lot of times people have in the disability world, and kind of giving us some tips and tricks, because we want to really make sure that we're covering those frequently asked questions that a lot of times we get within our organization, but really having external expertise from another person in our community is really important to us. So in another episode, we talk about kind of the asset limit in the disability world and kind of the unique nuances that go along with that. And so we want to dive in a little bit deeper about assets and the asset limit. And so one of the questions that I have about that is, does the asset limit apply to children with disabilities who live at home with their parents and or married couples?
Yeah, great question. So as far as when we talk about asset limit, we need to look at it from the perspective of both Social Security and Medicaid. And so if we're looking at Social Security for a child, for instance, then it's going to be supplemental security income. And that does have an asset limit, and the limit is $2,000. For married couples, for both SSI and for Medicaid, the asset limit for the two of them combined is $3,000. And then for Colorado Medicaid programs, the most common thing that we look at would be a waiver program. And for Colorado Medicaid waiver programs, they look at the assets and income of only the child. So they separate the child from the assets and income of the parent and look just at the child.
Got it. Yeah. And I think that can be really challenging, I think, for a family to navigate, but not only like if you're a married couple who each has, a disability and you're limited to that $3,000 cap, that can be really, really challenging, I think, to just manage everyday life. And so I want to talk a little bit about what are the assets that actually do count towards the asset limit?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I'm going to just talk more generally because there are some really specific things in the regulations, but I'm going to talk about kind of the most common assets that people have. So that would be any bank account that you have. So a checking account, savings account, an investment account, retirement account, which is something that people don't always think about because it's maybe doesn't feel as accessible. The other things that would count would be gold, silver, or excess cars or houses. So I'm going to talk a little bit about exempt resources, but if you've got 2 houses or 2 cars, then that's going to count as a resource to you as well.
Got it. And it's so funny that like gold and silver are incorporated in this. I mean, I'm wearing not a gold necklace today. Yes. So I know that it would not be counted towards my asset limit if I needed to follow that. But it's just funny because I feel like it's not very common anymore.
It is not.
It's kind of an old school way of thinking, I suppose. Yeah.
And now that I think of it, I don't know that it's specifically spelled out in the regulations, but I just attended a training yesterday on cryptocurrency. And so I would think that cryptocurrency would also count as a resource because it does have a value assigned to it.
Got it. Cryptocurrency.
More to come on that.
Apparently the new wave of the future, which is very complicated, I think, for anyone to understand.
Yes.
I have a family member in my life who is all about trying it out, and then they tried it out and they're like, this is too complicated. I don't understand it. So I'm done. So it was like a new hobby come and gone real quickly.
Yeah, that's probably better.
So you talked a little bit about kind of just like giving everyone a primer on the general assets that do count towards the asset limit, but what are assets that don't count towards the asset limit?
Yeah, so there are definitely some exempt assets or resources. And this would be for SSI and Medicaid purposes. So the home that the person lives in. Now, there are a few exceptions to that. So for an example of that would be if somebody has to have a surgery and go to a facility for 30 days of rehabilitation after the surgery, but they always have the intent to return to that home, it continues to be exempt during that period. Another example would be a vehicle. So again, if you have 2 vehicles, then the second vehicle that is of lesser value is going to count towards that asset limit. You have to be kind of careful when you're thinking about additional motor vehicles, like for instance, a 4-wheeler or an RV. That's where it gets really more specific in the regulations about what is exempt. A burial space or plan is going to be exempt as long as it's held irrevocably. So when you set up that pre-need burial plan, it's really important that you do an irrevocable assignment, which means that you can't cancel it or change it or cash it out for cash. And personal goods and personal effects, or household goods and personal effects, are also going to be exempt. There are a few limitations on that, but most common things that we have in our house, a washer, dryer, refrigerator, stove, TV, computer, those are all going to be exempt for these purposes. Grants and scholarships are exempt, not something as common. And then the area that we work in most, of course, is special needs trusts. And so as long as a trust is written according to the rules of Social Security and Medicaid and approved by those organizations, the certain trusts can also be exempt. So the trusts that we see most commonly that are exempt are disability trusts, income trusts, pooled trusts, and special needs trust or third-party trusts that are left by parents. And then the final would be ABLE accounts, which are also exempt under the rules.
That's great. And I know that Megan's going to talk a little bit towards the end about a little bit more about trusts, and then in another episode that we have, we're talking about ABLE accounts. So make sure that you tune into that if you're curious to learn a little bit more about that. But thank you for giving us all just kind of a general overview of what are the assets that count towards, what maybe do not count towards. But I think a big question people have is, okay, what if I have too many assets? What if I'm considered to have, I'm over? What could potentially happen?
Sure. So we're in a unique time because of COVID.
Sure.
So we are in a public health emergency, and that was just recently extended. So as long as we are in the public health emergency, all Medicaid benefits are considered locked in, which means that even if somebody is over-resourced, they cannot discontinue Medicaid benefits. Now keep in mind that does not apply to Social Security, Supplemental Security Income, SSI. So what could happen in ordinary times or for Social Security is that an overpayment would be issued and the person would be not eligible for those benefits until the asset or resource is spent down. So they could have to pay back money that was given to them during the time that they were ineligible, and they could lose their benefits during that period as well. I think it's also risky and possible that somebody could not only lose them, but they have to then reapply. And of course, if you're looking at somebody with developmental disability waiver, then they might have to get back on the waiting list. So there's a lot at stake here.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm. And I think it's so tricky because I feel like, it's all up to different perspective, but I feel like essentially, you can feel kind of stuck at times, knowing that I can only have, for example, $2,000 max in my bank account. If you're just, if you go over that, then you run this risk of being considered over the asset limit. And so it is a little tricky because it really does happen. You could lose essential programs that someone needs for their day-to-day lives, such as a Medicaid HCBS waiver.
Sure.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate you giving us a general overview of kind of those frequently asked questions about assets.
Yeah.
Kind of going into a new conversation, you've talked a little bit about Social Security and things like that, and there's kind of like this acronym alphabet soup oftentimes.
Yes.
In the disability world, there's so many acronyms to try to remember and everything. And so a frequently asked question we get are, what on earth is the difference between SSI, Ssdi, and SSA? They all sound the same, but they are all very uniquely different. So would you care to answer that for everyone?
I'd be happy to.
Thank you.
Well, just dive right into the alphabet soup.
Gotta love it.
Okay. So the first I'll talk about is SSI, which it stands for Supplemental Security Income. It is a needs-based program, which means that you have to be, and I'm going to just use the Social Security terms here, not necessarily politically correct, but you have to be elderly, blind, or disabled in order to get SSI. You also have to have a need, which means that there is that resource or asset test. So you can't have any other income, or very little income, and the resources have to be less than $2,000. The other program, by the way, we mostly see that for people under the age of 65, but there are a few occasions in which somebody doesn't have any work history that they might be on SSI when they're older. The other program you mentioned is Social Security. I like to think of this as retirement Social Security. So it's the traditional Social Security that we think of that most people qualify for as they're now, I think it's 66 and a half when they reach full retirement age.
It keeps changing. I don't feel like I better retire until I'm like 80 now.
I think it might be by the time we get there. So that is based on work history, and it's not needs-based. So in other words, you can have $1 million in the bank and still receive retirement Social Security. And also you don't have to meet any other criteria except for your age. And then the third that you mentioned is SSDI, which stands for Social Security Disability Insurance. This is for people with disabilities who become disabled before the age of full retirement. The other thing that I'll come back to that, what medical benefits come with them.
Sure.
SSDI, much like Social Security, is based on work history. So you have to have enough work quarters in order to qualify. And your award that you get is going to be based on the amount of work that you have put in. Most of us get a statement every 2 years from Social Security that says, if you became disabled, this would be your amount. Or if you retire at this age, this would be your amount. So that kind of gives you a guide to what that would look like.
That's helpful.
I should also mention with SSDI that after 2 years of eligibility, you qualify for Medicare. With SSI, you qualify in the state of Colorado. It's automatic to qualify for Medicaid if you're on SSI. That does vary by state to state, so that's a Colorado specific thing.
Got it.
The other thing is that SSI has a capped award amount. I forgot to mention that. So that's currently in 2022, it's $841. And that goes up every year, typically, with a cost of living adjustment. Now, it's possible that somebody could be on more than one program. They might be on both SSI and Ssdi. The reason for that is that this is where it gets in the weeds a little bit, so
That's okay.
forgive me. But you can always get $20 of income that is not counted by Social Security. And so if you get the SSDI and it is less than SSI plus $20 or $861, then you can qualify for both. And you can get both SSI and SSDI. And then there's one more benefit that I need to mention.
No, I love it. I
Which
think
is,
it's great. These are these questions that people often have, so I appreciate you taking the time.
This is most specific. I would say we see it most commonly with people with intellectual developmental disabilities, and that's to qualify for, it used to be called Social Security Disabled Adult Child. And now they just call it SSDI Child Benefit. And that is for people who have deemed to be disabled by the Social Security Administration before the age of 22. Then they can qualify under their parents' benefit when their parent either goes on Social Security themselves or is deceased. And the benefit of that, of course, is that they may be on SSI their whole life until they qualify under their parents' benefit, and that could really bump up the amount that they get per month. Mm-hmm. And that further qualifies them to receive Medicare in addition to Medicaid.
Which is great. Yeah. And I'm so happy you talked about the SSDI and the child benefit, because I think that's something a lot of times people don't realize.
Yes.
Or I have a family member this happened to where they just suddenly realized like this was an option and they had no idea.
Yes.
So I really appreciate you covering that as well.
It's really important to apply for Social Security benefits before the age of 22. It could be determined after that, but I think you've got a lot more assurance if you get that determination before the person turns 22.
That's great advice. Thank you.
Sure.
I love that.
Sure.
You're just going through the alphabet soup. I love it. That's what we needed.
It's what we do.
That's what we needed.
Yeah.
So another frequently asked question that we get is, why might someone have a representative payee, or sometimes people call it a rep payee, and what are their responsibilities and or limitations?
Sure. So again, when Social Security determines, and this is through a medical doctor, when they determine that due to the person's age or disability, they're not able to manage their own monthly Social Security benefit, then they would appoint a representative payee. So the rep payee has the responsibility of taking in the person's income on a monthly basis and then spending it for that person's benefit. They are charged with spending it primarily on food, shelter, and medical expenses. And then all of the other things come in after those are provided for. So, it might be a cable or phone bill or spending money or walking around money for the person, but they have to meet those requirements first. A rep payee then has the responsibility of reporting to Social Security on an annual basis for how the money has been spent. Our organization, as I mentioned in the beginning, is an organizational payee. So we are further required to, it ends up being typically every 2 years undergoing an audit by the Social Security Administration as well. A rep payee is limited. They're not a guardian. They're not a conservator.
Right.
And so they're not able to be a legal decision maker for the person. They're not able to enter into contracts on their behalf, even though people try to get rep payees to do that all the time. So there are definitely some limitations with what they actually have the authority to do.
Which I think is so important, because I think a lot of times there's this full range of surrogate and supportive decision making that someone may have in their life. It could be a rep payee, it could be a guardian, it could be a conservator. medical proxy,
Right.
power of attorney, right?
Mhm.
But Rep Payee is solely responsible for the duties that you just said. Nothing else that I had mentioned.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And only for the Social Security funds
Exactly.
too. They also don't have authority over any other kind of income.
That's great. Thank you for getting us through that. I appreciate
Sure.
it. Another really frequently asked question that we get is, so through our work, we often work with people with developmental disabilities. And so, as we know, there's unique nuances to everyone's lives. And so it may be a person with a developmental disability who ultimately they are incredibly independent. They live on their own. They pay all their own bills. They have a job. They don't really need a whole lot of help. Then there could be someone who maybe needs a lot of help and will always need to live at home with family or a caregiver, for example, that maybe they grew up with, right? To help make sure that they have clothing, have meals, or have their personal needs taken care of. And so something we run into a lot is parents often have questions is like, okay, my child just turned 18. What does that look like with their SSI or their SSDI? And should I be charging room and board? And if I am charging room and board, should I be tracking that?
Right.
Yeah, this is a
right.
complicated question we get a lot.
Sure.
Yeah.
So I think the first thing I would say is most people are not going to be eligible for SSI until they turn 18 because they're going to be looking at the assets of the whole household. So the first thing is to apply for SSI. Once the person is found eligible, I definitely recommend that parents charge for room and board. And the reason for that is because if you're on SSI and you are living in another person's home, that is considered in-kind support and maintenance. And if you receive that without compensating the person for that, you're actually going to have your benefit reduced by 1/3. So you're going to get less money in SSI. So that's the main reason why you should charge room and board. I think that a good rule of thumb is to charge 1/3 for room and board. That's going to offset the cost to the family and it's also going to set people up for independence later on if they do move out of the home. So there's a couple of good reasons for that. The other question you asked is about tracking it. When your son or daughter does get SSI, they need to have their own bank account. If you're Representative Payee, you need to have a separate bank account that those funds are going into. And you should be keeping detailed records because you're going to need to report back to SSI how the funds were spent and how much was spent on room and board or rent, shelter. So yes, you definitely need to document. As far as how far you need to take that, I mean, you could be as comprehensive as having a lease agreement. I don't think that's necessary in most situations, and think just an invoice or something documenting what is being paid and the amount is sufficient.
I think that's great advice. And I also, I think it's kind of this odd balance of, well, they're my family member or my kid. I've always taken care of them. I feel weird charging room and board, they're a family member, but your advice is so important and critical really in making sure that person continues to get the benefits that they need. And also I think the tracking piece of thing is so critically important because if you don't track, you get in a lot of trouble.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. And I also think it's up to the parents for what they want to do with those funds. So if they want to collect that room and board and turn around at the end of the year and make a contribution to a trust or an ABLE account or pay on a life insurance policy that their child will benefit from, they can certainly do that, and maybe that helps them with that decision making. It's ultimately going to benefit their son or daughter with a disability.
Absolutely. That's such great advice. Thank you so much.
Of course.
And then another question that we often have is because we've talked about the alphabet soup, if you will. We've talked about the asset limit as well as, all these other unique questions that we get asked a lot of times. But something that is hard to figure out is, what if they want to do investments or some type of money management? Do you have any tips or advice?
Sure. Well, I think that financial money management skills are critical for all of us, especially people with disabilities. And it's important to teach those skills based on the person's level of comprehension, level of skill. And so that's going to look very unique for each individual. I think my advice would be to start small, and see, you don't have to go out and teach everything. You wouldn't start with investments, for instance. You'd start with how do you manage a budget or a checking account, and how do you manage a debit card, those types of things. And then you can build on it and eventually work on investments and other pieces. Of course, you have to keep government benefits in mind when you are looking at investments. Keeping in mind what we talked about earlier with the resources, that it's going to count towards an asset limit if the person is on a needs-based benefit. But that doesn't mean that you can't do it. It just has to be done in a different way.
Yeah.
And then I would also suggest there are a couple of tools out there that can really help with teaching that financial independence. One of them that we utilize a lot is the TrueLink card. It's a prepaid debit card that the owner is actually, like in our case, the trustee, or it could be the parent. They have all of the controls. They can stop the card at any time if there's any question of theft or it gets lost. And then in addition to that, you have many controls. So it's very easy. You can do it with an app on your phone and turn certain things on and off. So for instance, you might start with saying, I'm only going to allow purchases at a convenience store, or I'm only going to allow purchases at a grocery store, and you can turn it on and off at that level. Or we're only going to use this card for gas purchases, and use it in that way. And you can monitor where the account is being used, where the account is attempting to be used, or the card is attempted to be used. So it gives you a lot of control, and then over time you can really see what skills you need to work on and what maybe changes you could make with that card. ABLE accounts have similar features with debit cards, and so I think that's another great tool to use with slowly teaching or having some more and more independence as you go.
That's great. That's some really great advice. I had no idea about that card.
Sure.
I love that. That's why I love these podcasts, because then you get to learn all these wonderful resources in the community. I love that.
Yeah.
Well, those are all the questions that I had for you. Did you have anything else to add before we leave our viewers and listeners?
Sure. Yeah, a couple of things.
Sure.
I've talked a couple of times about Social Security and Medicaid regulations, and so I just wanted to give a little more information about how to access those. So I find the Colorado Medicaid website to be really helpful and have a lot of information on it. So they've got a pretty good search engine on it, so you can really just go there and type in what you're looking for. The Social Security regulations are in the format called the POMS, which is the Program Operations Manual System. It's a little more difficult.
Sounds a little complicated already.
A little complicated.
The POMS, there's another acronym to add to our alphabet.
Another acronym. But with the POMS, what I have found is that if you go to a Google search engine and type in POMS and what your question is, you're going to find your answer a lot easier.
Got it.
But I also wanted to offer CFPD as a resource to people. We do a lot of education in the community to professionals and to family members, and so we're happy to answer questions for people that you have that are maybe more in the nitty-gritty and specific. We're happy to be a resource in the community. And then the final thing that I wanted to talk about is using trusts as another tool for planning for people with disabilities. So, that can be used with our pooled trust or with individual trusts. It can be used with assets that belong to the individual, which is a first-party trust, and then also with assets that are belonging to the parent with a third-party trust. And I know that you're going to have ABLE accounts as another topic, and we like to think of ABLE really as a tool in the toolbox alongside trusts. One of the reasons for that, especially as families are looking at planning or if somebody comes into money of their own, is that ABLE accounts do have contribution limits every year. Trusts do not. And so if families especially are looking at a trust for their family member for the future, we really recommend that they meet with an attorney I don't think it's ever too early to start that planning and thinking about and who the trustee is going to be, how you're going to save for that, and do all of that planning. But CFPD administers more trusts for people with disabilities than anyone else in the state, and we are known nationally for our service, especially that we have case managers and connect with people very individually and directly, and so we are happy to be a resource to the community when they're considering that planning.
That's great. And I think it's really, I appreciate you sharing with people, it's never too early to start.
Mm-hmm.
I think contingency planning can be a really hard and tricky and complicated thing for anyone to try to figure out, like, well, what happens if, this family member is no longer here, or if there's an emergency or whatever it is, and really planning for that, I think, is really great advice. So I appreciate you sharing that.
Yes, absolutely.
Great.
Yeah.
Well, Megan, thank you so much for being with me today. To our viewers and listeners, thank you so much for tuning in. And just while we covered all these really frequently asked questions that people often have about disability assets and finances and really what you need to know. So thank you so much for joining us, and we can't wait to see you next time. And in the meantime, stay curious. Take care.
Thank you.